so much for being here, and I know you are all beautiful people, and thank you for being here tonight on a lovely Wednesday evening in San Francisco Public Library's virtual library. My name's Anissa. I'm your librarian host tonight, and I'll also be taking notes as we go along. There's a link that I put in the chat box, and I'll update that, and that link is live, but I'll also be sending you a follow-up email after the event tomorrow. So I want to welcome you all to the unceded land of the Ohlone tribal people, and we acknowledge the many Ramaytush Ohlone tribal groups and families as the rightful stewards in the lands on which we reside and work here in our beautiful Bay Area. SFPL is committed to sharing knowledge, spreading events, and making sure, we're all in solidarity, which same for Black Lives Matter. The library is not a neutral institution. And so we stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and are working in our own institution to end systemic racism. And again, the library loves book lists and loves to spread factual knowledge. So the document I'm going to send to you later has a ton of different documents and book lists and all sorts of great sites that you should visit about both Black Lives Matter and not just Black Lives Matter, but also Black joy, Black artists, Afrofuturism, Afrojujuism. It's a long list. So I won't keep talking about it, but it's a great list. And I'm just gonna breeze through a few things here, and you can all see my screen, I hope. So our featured on the same page artist of August is Virgie Tovar. So an on the same page is it's a monthly read for the moment, but it's generally a bi-monthly read. So Summer of Self-Love. Virgie will have a book club on Sunday talking about You Have the Right to Remain Fat. And then on Tuesday, the 18th, Virgie will be in the house. So come check that out. We appreciate it. She is definitely fun and feminist fun. Let me say that. Let's see, why does my arrows not want to work? Citizen, our social justice book club on Monday the 17th at 7 p.m. Another gorgeous, beautiful book. We do have it in ebook format and audio, but I encourage you, if you can find the actual hard copy, it's a piece of art as well. That does not want to work. Okay. We're going to breeze through these, but in my document, you'll be able to find a link to all of our wonderful events. And if you aren't on our website or on our mailing list, definitely that link is there as well too. Upcoming for September and October, we'll be celebrating Latinx Heritage Month and lots of amazing things, including, oh, did I forget that slide? I'm bummed. Nope, there it is, on the same page. Benjamin Bach Sierra. He is an educator, a poet, activist, mission native, and an educator at City College. So one of my favorite schools in all of San Francisco. And he will be celebrating the long-awaited sequel to Barrio Bushido, Pura Neta. So super excited about that. And he's going to be in convo with Luis Rodriguez. This is just like a check mark off my promotion list, I swear. So please come check that out. We are super excited to have both of those men and authors and activists in the house. So revolutionary. But lots of other great stuff. We're partnering with the Mexican Museum. If you haven't heard of Daniel Azama, oh my God, his art is just mind-blowing, mystical, and wonderful. He'll be speaking to us from Mexico. So some of the silver linings of virtual programming are we have an artist from Mexico, which is amazing. So lots of great stuff. San Francisco notorious Will Menez will be talking about the Diego Rivera, which is being moved to the SOMA. So this is a chance. I have been wooing Will for almost 2 years to come to a program. So it's finally happening. So please come check it out. He is super knowledgeable on this mural. All right. And I know I have, oh yes, crucial. Please, they're trying to not let us get counted. So please, they cut us by a month on this. It is so important. It's in 28 million languages. Do your census. It takes 9 minutes. It brings in $20,000 to our community per count. Every single person in your household counts, including, you know, tiny babies. They count. Tell everybody to take your census. And don't be afraid, because that's what they want. So also, we could lose a seat in the House of Representatives if we don't get this count. So please, I'm super passionate about it. You can't tell. Oh, what? SFL, SFPL to go. It's happening. 2 sites right now, the Main and Excelsior. So you can now place holds on books. Woo! Yay. Mask Up, beautiful art by Samuel Rodriguez. And this is about keeping all of those people who have to work daily out there in the streets safe. You know, not about you going out into get gas. It's about that person selling you the gas. So please, 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 please. And you can get tested. sf.gov, city test SF, super easy. Poke your nose out the window and you're done. And 2 days later, you have your results. So it's super easy. Let's just get this thing done with. So some Zoom housekeeping. Tonight we'll be taking questions and answers in our chat box, and we'll have time for that at the end. And I'm sure we'll also probably let you raise your hand and talk as well. But that is, oh yes, we can't forget these guys, our friends at the San Francisco Public Library, who love us, we love them, and they support all the great things we do and all the authors we try to bring and all these campaigns, and they have been rolling with us during this closure. So we thank our friends. You should follow them on social media as well, and they do great things with us. All right, now for the main event. Tonight, we are so excited to have Marke Bieschke in the house. Yay! So if you don't know Marke Bieschke, he's the publisher and arts editor of 48 Hills and the SF Bay Guardian, and the author of Queer, the Ultimate LGBTQ Guide for Teens. And tonight's book we're celebrating, Into the Streets, A Young Person's Visual History of Protest in the United States, which is now available online from the library. Just noticed today, so you can check it out from the library. It's linked in that document. And he is also just signed with Oxford University Press as a contributor to the Oxford Handbook of Electronic Music, out later this year. He writes for several international publications about queer and underground dance music history, and is a member of the Stud Collective, which owns 54-year-old San Francisco queer nightclub, The Stud. Yay, The Stud. We all love The Stud. We already miss it. He lives in the Lower Haight with his husband, David Schnur, atop a golden hoard of physical media. As you can see from his background shelfie, yay. And so this doc also contains Marke's social media platforms, which follow Marke on Twitter. I learned all sorts of wonderful stuff. So I am gonna now shut down. I'll be following on chat. You'll get a link to the doc and turning it over. Marke.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you so much to the library for hosting me. Nisa, thank you for the introduction. Today, we're going to talk about my book, Into the Streets, A Young Person's Visual History of Protest in the United States. And I just love the fact that I'm here talking about it with the library, because I did so much research using the library for this book. This is the first book of its kind that's ever been written for adults or for young people that puts together a history of protest, resistance, demonstrations, boycotts. It picks about 35 of the key incidents like that and puts them all together in one book and focuses on the visuals that came out of the protest, the cultural histories, the symbols, the signals, the media kind of manipulations that were used in each of these protests in order to help protesters get the message out. So obviously that was a big task, because the history of the United States and protests in the United States goes way back to even centuries before there was a United States, pre-colonial times. where we had where there was obviously Native American resistance to colonists that were coming to the shores of the continent. There were rebellions of enslaved people against the colonists and owners who were exploiting them so cruelly. There was all kinds of discrimination going on, religious discrimination, social discrimination, economic discrimination that was happening before the United States even formed. So there was a lot to cover there. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have so much going on right now in terms of protest. I think we all kind of can acknowledge that. But even in the past few years, protest has really exploded in the United States as kind of a social event. It's something that's really become part of our landscape more so than perhaps our parents or grandparents knew, mostly because of social media, the internet, the 24-hour cable news cycle, as well as just people getting a lot smarter about getting their message of protest and resistance out to people. So we're kind of we think we're inundated with protests now, but really in the past 40, 50 years, we've seen so many more protests happening since the great civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, all the way through to 2018's March for Our Lives, where high school students went on a crusade for gun control, Greta Thunberg's climate strikes, that really reverberated around the world as young people took up arms against the climate crisis. And we're trying to raise awareness about that right now through this very exciting moment where we're seeing Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests, hopefully leading to reforms, concrete reforms in the way the country is governed and the way it's policed, as the way laws are enforced. So that's a big spectrum of protests, and I was so happy to explore so much of that in the book and put it in visual terms for young people to kind of see what the history of this resistance that they see all around them now has been. The original idea for the book came while I was writing my last book, Queer, the Ultimate LGBTQ Guide for Teens, and realizing that so much of the contemporary gay rights and gay liberation movement came out of protests and riots. And I really wanted to focus on that. And I felt that that part of queer history was a little bit buried in all the pride messaging we see today. A lot of the fights for gay marriage, etc., were rooted in these fabulous riots, the Stonewall Riots, the marches on Washington in the 1980s and 1990s, and even before Stonewall, when groups of gay people got together to do marches and acts of resistance and underground communication. So I was talking to my publisher, and she proposed the idea, why not write a history of protests in general, so that young people who are curious about what's been going on in US political history can look back and see all the vibrant ways that people have spoken out, from Native American resistance, as I mentioned, through Black rights, Black power, gay rights, gay liberation, women's rights. We're celebrating the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment this year. And so we obviously wanted to include all the great suffragettes and suffragism movements that were happening that led to this. As well as here we are in San Francisco, which is its own kind of capital of resistance, I would say. I mean, here we have the hippie movement, the flower children. We have so much, the anti-nuclear resistance came, some of the big moments of it came from San Francisco activists. And so I wanted to celebrate our hometown as well, right up through the George Floyd protests when young people led huge protests. Simone Jacques, a high school student, led a protest of 10,000 people through the Mission that made global news. So San Francisco is still hopping in terms of protest, and I wanted to make sure that young people in San Francisco knew that they had that legacy as well to look back upon. I'm going to do some readings from the book, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about what it covers as well. I mean, this is obviously targeted for young people, and we live in such a visual time. You know, we're kind of bombarded with images. And so I really wanted to tell the story in a way that would relate to people automatically using photographs, posters, pamphlets, lithographs from before there were photographs, news reports, news clippings. You'll find all of that here in the book as I talk about each individual protest. We move chronologically through the last 500 years. And obviously you can see one of the great sub-themes of the book is you can see the development of media as protests progressed in the United States. You know, obviously we start with drawings or oral histories of protest, some rare photographs. I mean, we're so privileged to have photographs of people like Harriet Tubman and under the Underground Railroad, and the early suffragette movement, some of these great iconic images as photography developed. And we see how protesters began using media to help get their information across right up to the present day with social media hashtags. So one of the histories in the book is kind of the development of how protesters and people in resistance movements thought about how can we use visuals to get our message across in newspapers or in iconic things like the peace symbol, the rainbow flag, the AIDS quilt. So these are all kinds of really exciting developments that I get to talk about. Another great thing about writing a history of protest and putting it all together in a book is you really get to see the issues that have dogged the United States throughout its history, and the very incremental progress we've made on addressing those issues of racism, sexism, homophobia, economic disparity, the way we treat veterans, all kinds of real issues that have come through, nuclear arms, war in general, environmental causes. These have all really been concerns from the beginning, and we see cycles of these concerns coming to a head and being talked about. And gradually through our history, it seems like we go 2 steps forward and a few steps back and 2 steps forward, but we've been wrestling with these issues throughout history. And so one of the great things of the book is being able to see the development of how we've addressed those issues throughout our history. And I also include in the book some conservative protests, because that's another thread, fascinating, horrifying thread that's gone through our history. Sometimes a corrective thread, where starting with anti-immigrant protests, through Ku Klux Klan rallies, through the modern day Tea Party protests and Charlottesville protests, you can see there's 2 sides of a coin of Americans using their right to gather and express themselves and redress the government of grievances. That it's not just all flower children and hippies and activists in these long marches. There's also a darker side to the history of protests in the United States. And I felt it was important to include that as well, so that young people could see that these symbols and these issues can also be manipulated to other ends, and they could have a more clear vision of how to address their own issues that they would want to protest about or be upset about. Because I think one of the great benefits of the book is that young people will be able to see the things that they're upset about now have a 500-year history of being addressed in this country. So I'm really happy to have put out the book. A little side note about the book, it was originally supposed to come out. I did not write it during the current times. I wrote it mostly last year, huddled away using library books. And it was supposed to come out earlier this year, but it got delayed because of the pandemic, understandably. But then when the George Floyd protests happened and the country burst into this like phenomenal outburst of resistance and conversation, the book was moved up. So it's kind of sailed on its own winds of protest history. And I'm just glad it's out now and that people are starting to be able to get it in these very interesting times. So yeah, so the book does focus on some famous images. I don't know if you can see here the famous flower children image of Vietnam protester George Harris as he put carnations into different guns over a protest outside the Pentagon. We have the official program of the women's suffrage procession. Let me see if I can do this. I wish I could share my screen. That was a pamphlet that was drawn up for the women's suffrage parade, a grand parade in 1913 that helped bring the different strands of the women's movement back then together to agitate for the vote. There's so many famous and familiar ones, from the Boston Tea Party images, through to the great civil rights images where Martin Luther King is talking, is giving his great speeches, the March in Selma, the great boycott, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Larry Itliong, some of the leaders of the early immigrant workers organization and unionization movement, all the way through some of the ones we know today or we're familiar with today, the Iraq invasion protests that were still among the largest global protests in the world against the invasion of Iraq, the nuclear disarmament marches of the 1980s, that still in New York, those are still the biggest protests they've ever had in the history of the state. The Democratic National Convention protests of 1968. And of course, as Anissa, if you caught in the introduction, Anissa behind her had a poster of Alcatraz. And of course, we have, there's a fantastic thread throughout the history of protests of Native American resistance, including the occupation of Alcatraz, right through the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, which are also included in the book. So yeah, it's a very colorful, vibrant history of what we've done in the United States. And we obviously still have a ton more work to do, but it's just encouraging that we're seeing protesting become such a part of our civil life, online and off. So I'm gonna read a couple pieces that introduce symbols of protest to young people and older people. Here's one about, where did the peace symbol come from? Read a little bit from that. Where did the peace symbol come from? It's most often equated with a fashionable California hippie culture of the 1960s, sewn onto pockets of bell-bottom jeans, painted on the sides of Volkswagen vans, and waved on giant flags. But the iconic peace symbol, a circle with what looks like a bent fork inside it, was created for a very specific purpose, to symbolize the nuclear disarmament movement. Designed by Gerald Holton in 1958 for the British Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the symbol combines two letters, N and D, for nuclear disarmament, from the alphabet of semaphore, a visual language used to communicate between ships, often signaling distress. Holton, a professional designer and conscientious objector who had spent World War I working on an English farm, was in a state of distress himself when he was asked to design signs for a 52-mile anti-nuclear march from London to an atomic weapons research facility. The peace symbol had a double meaning for him. I was in despair, deep despair, about the state of the world, Holton wrote in a letter to the editor of Peace News magazine. I drew myself, the representative of an individual in despair, with hands, palms outstretched upwards and downwards in the manner of a prisoner before the firing squad. It was ridiculous at first, and such a puny thing. I formalized the drawing into a line and put a circle around it, Holton said. I thought it was silly until someone pointed out how cool it looked. I gave him a button of the peace symbol and he wore it. That gave me the confidence to present it as the new logo of the anti-nuclear movement, which quickly adopted it. And now that symbol is the universal symbol for peace. Interesting origin there that I didn't even know. And I think I used the SF Public Library's database to find that out, actually. We're going to flash forward now to 1987. And I have a chapter called Out and Proud for LGBTQ Rights, which covers the second March on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi equal rights and liberation in 1987. That was a huge march, and obviously it was a very important march because here we are in 1987. This was the height of AIDS. Reagan was nearing the end of his rule. People were angry about a lot of things, economics. There had been a lot of broiling. The gay community was at wit's end of how to deal with the pandemic that was affecting it. It was a very turbulent time, especially to be a gay person in the United States when you had the religious right telling you that you were going to hell for being gay. So many people were kicked out of their houses. Many of them found their way to San Francisco. It was for a group of people, let alone 100,000 people, to come out of the closet and gather in Washington in 1987 was a huge deal. And the symbolism that came out of that was giant. That was the pride flag became ubiquitous after that. And the AIDS quilt was displayed for the first time as a site of mourning for the gay community. And it was also a site of jubilation because it was like suddenly tens of thousands of gay people were seeing each other in real life. This was before the internet, and often it could feel like you were the only gay person in the world. Let alone lesbian, bisexual, transgender. Some people just felt invisible at that time, and there wasn't really the giant community connection that we have now. So this protest that happened in 1987, the giant march, featured all kinds of people of all different backgrounds, all different colors, coming together and partying. There was a giant mass wedding, which obviously same-sex marriage was illegal then, but people performed these huge weddings with people of all genders getting married. It was just a really celebratory atmosphere, but it also had a purpose, and it helped to energize people to fight for the medicines that help, for access to the medicines that would eventually help a lot of people in becoming control of their HIV. It helped put energy back into the fight for same-sex marriage, for protections in the workplace, for LGBTQ people. And so, it was just a joy to dig back into something like this and see where a lot of what we enjoy today, a lot of the rights that we enjoy today came from people standing up and speaking out by the tens of thousands. This is my summary of the origin of the rainbow flag, called A Rainbow Flag for Pride. How did the rainbow become the symbol of the LGBTQ community? Ever since the Stonewall Riots in 1969, gay people had gathered every year to commemorate the anniversary of that first major gay uprising. With picnics in parks and public rallies, they celebrated what became known as Gay Freedom Day. Two cities, Chicago and Los Angeles, also held small marches for gay civil rights. These first marches were very quiet. Soon, however, other cities started hosting their own marches, combining celebrations of gay identity with determined political purpose. These pride parades became famous for brightly decorated floats and outspoken community contingents, but something seemed to be missing: an instantly recognizable symbol that would stand for the gay community. In 1977, San Francisco artist Gilbert Baker had a vision to design something that represented the dawn of a new gay consciousness and freedom. The original US flag of 13 stars and 13 stripes, which hung everywhere for the country's 1976 bicentennial anniversary celebrations, inspired Baker. He also took inspiration from the gay nightclubs and parties he went to, which combined all different kinds of people on the dance floor. So Baker fashioned a rainbow flag that reflected the diversity and values of the gay community as it fought for its own liberation. The flag consists of different colored stripes, each representing a specific meaning, from spirit, violet, to healing, orange, and life, red. The flag flew at the 1978 Pride Parades and was an immediate hit. The rainbow graces everything from bracelets to tattoos now, representing LGBTQ pride. That was a lovely piece to write, and I kind of counterbalance it in the chapter with the AIDS quilt and the creation of the AIDS quilt to show the two sides. There was one side of celebration with the flag and another side of mourning with the quilt. And that, I think, is those two things are great examples of the branding and the kind of media savvy that protesters developed throughout the history of protest in order to get their means across. It also shows that protests can be a lot of different things. They're everything from massive marches and parades down to demonstrations, sit-ins, boycotts. Now we have hashtags and online petitions. I start the book with the famous walkouts in 1968 in Los Angeles of Latino students that became known as the Brownouts, when high school students decided to protest the treatment they were receiving, the racist treatment, the sexist treatment. Teachers were not teaching bilingual classes. It was forbidden to speak Spanish in public schools. Students were being spanked if they spoke Spanish. Women students were told, young women were told that they would never go to college because their culture ensured that they would stay home and pregnant throughout their life. There was a huge amount of discrimination. And in 1968, a bunch of students rose up and started walking out of their classroom. And that started a movement across the country that kind of gave energy to the Chicano rights movement of the time and showed that young people could change things, because what happened in the end was the Los Angeles School District did change things to accommodate students more. And that was just an example of how even as a student, you can stand up in school and start your own protest. Talking back to the teacher is another form of protest, which was really great. And that Brownouts protest that I start the book with, that's a great example of how young people can affect immediate change. So much of the protests are being driven by young people today, and so much have been before throughout our history. And I really wanted to inspire young people to see themselves in some of these young protesters throughout our history. Now, what I also talk about in the book is how protests don't always immediately change things. These themes that we see throughout the United States history of resistance, civil rights, Black civil rights, Native American agency, the reparations, social justice. These are long, centuries-long things that we've worked on that's taken deep work by participants. What we see with the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd uprising throughout the country today is the result of really deep work by activists throughout decades, and especially since the Ferguson protests 5 years ago, to educate people, to expand people's minds to be able to be open to learning about these protester messages, to brand things. Black Lives Matter is a fantastic slogan that we see slip into everyday conversation. You can barely not see it now when you go online, and that's just such a great success story of branding something and making something stick in people's minds that helps the long time work come to fruition on these various things. And the other thing that I really do address is that, as I said, protests don't always have immediate results. They don't automatically make the change that you're looking for, but that doesn't mean that they're not successful. Protests serve so many different purposes, just from a civil standpoint of exercising our rights to gather and protest, to free speech, redress of grievances from the government, so that we can ensure that those rights are still powerful and open to all. But in a less abstract meaning, protests can serve to affirm your own feelings. When you go to a protest and you see that other people feel the same way that you do, that really helps you on a psychological level, on an emotional level. Your frustration can sometimes be alleviated just by being around other people who feel that way. Protesting can also serve to be a moral act, that you can tell yourself, hey, I made a stand for something. We see that with the huge marches and protests against the Iraq invasion in 2003, which had absolutely no effect on the war. We really didn't see suddenly countries saying, oh my gosh, there's 20 million people marching up around the globe against this, we should stop. That did not happen at all. But what did happen is we still see the repercussions today of the people who took part in those protests and made a stand versus the people who didn't. There's been political fallout from that, where people have lost elections because they supported the invasion. There's been moral implications where a lot of us can look back and say, hey, we took a stand against that. And we can feel more like we have our own power in that way. And another good thing that protest does is it's a means of communication and networking. Getting together, talking to other people, bringing together different viewpoints from within the same movement of resistance can lead to these very fruitful and very fantastic things down the line, because you've built these communication networks. You've taken down everyone's email, so you've built an email tree. You've had everyone sign the petition. You've got everyone's Twitter handle. Those things will lead down the line to easier communication and building a movement in a lot of different ways. So I thought it was important to not kind of give the illusion that if you go out and march and make a sign, everything's going to go your way, or on the other way, that if you do something and nothing happens, then you failed. Because really just standing up and speaking your mind and communicating with others and finding more of your people who feel the same way really helps you survive, especially in an oppressive atmosphere like the United States often exudes. The silencing, the just erasure, the way a lot of people are made to feel invisible. There's great power in coming together and uniting your voice as one. So that's my presentation on the book, Into the Streets. I would love if anybody has some wonderful questions to ask me. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Anissa.
I stuck a few in your chat box.
Thank you. I'm looking at it right now. So we've got some good questions here. The first question is, have I contacted SF schools to get this onto their curriculum? And I'm happy to say that several high school teachers have adopted the book by themselves in order to teach. It's not officially on a public school curriculum yet. We're working towards that, and I'm really excited to keep working on that. Things are a bit chaotic with forming curricula right now. But we are working to get this in schools, and libraries across the country are starting to carry it too, which is very encouraging. And then the other question is, are there any images of the final vote in the Tennessee legislators that secured the passage of the Women's Right to Vote Amendment in August 1920? We do not have that. What I did focus on was the women's procession in 1913, because it was such a kind of moment that brought everyone together, from the earlier work of Susan B. Anthony and the founders of the women's movement, to the more contemporary then leaders who were gathering together to try to push the legislation through. So we have photos of this grand procession, which itself was a media spectacle. The women deliberately got together and said, how can we get newspapers across the country to carry photos of our march so that we can get the message out? And they came up with some really innovative ideas. Not only were there women dressed as Greek goddesses riding white horses and performing little tableau vivants where they like posed in different poses of great moments in women's history, but they also decided to have contingents of women marching under what the women did for a living, in order to show the United States how important women's work was. There were contingents of washerwomen, there were contingents of housewives. I think there were even contingents of school teachers and librarians, where America could see that there were so many women who brought so much to the table that it was ridiculous that they couldn't vote. What complicated that original march was an internal division within the party about whether Black women could march. And I'd like to highlight the complexities of a lot of these protests too. For the women's procession in 1913, originally Black women were going to be barred from marching because it wouldn't look good to the rest of America. This is the kind of risk that you take on when you decide to make your protests more palatable to the media, is the erasure of minorities, because it may not look good. Luckily, there were few in the movement who stood up and said that they were not going to stand for this. Black women were eventually allowed to march at the back of the procession, the very back of the procession. And we see kind of those divisions continue on today, or still be discussed today in the women's movement. But those kind of conflicts were there from the very beginning. So as an interesting thing to talk about. From Carl, what surprised you most about the research you did? So I think one of the things that surprised me, the protest that surprised me the most, because I had not heard anything about it, was the New Orleans massacre of 1866. It's under my chapter called An Early Stand for Black Civil Rights. And what it was this chapter really tackles after slavery was officially ended in the United States. This was 1866, year after the Civil War ended. What happened to Black people? I mean, a lot of education and what we learn just kind of lets the story trail off there. And this protest that became a terrible tragedy kind of encapsulates what happened. At first, in 1866 in the South, Black people were full of hope. Black people were running for office. They were going to be elected. The vote was, Black people were being officially enfranchised, in many areas, or at least promised to be enfranchised for the first time and be able to vote. So there was a great excitement, and the Republican convention that was happening in New Orleans at the time, one of its major planks was to allow Black people full citizenship and to vote, and figure out how to do that. And so there was a great parade, an exciting parade, a big band of Black men, women, and children who decided that they were going to march to the courthouse where the Republican Party was meeting and have a great rally on the steps. Well, unfortunately, American history intervened and a white mob attacked them and killed scores of people. These were unarmed men, women, and children. The men fought back as much as they could. Some of them did have guns, but it just was a terrible massacre and tragedy. And so those kind of things, this kind of racism was set from the very beginning. So that really surprised me because that connected a lot of dots of what we're seeing from the very beginning of the United States history, all through the protests that we're seeing today. So that was a protest. I did see someone asked to put in a plug for Crip Camp, which is, yes, disability rights is a huge struggle in the United States and a fabulous story. And there's a documentary called Crip Camp on Netflix now, which is fascinating and tells the story of the early disability rights movement. And it's highly recommended. I really enjoyed that film a lot. Let's see if we have any others here. I do talk about Harvey Milk and some of the resistance that the gay rights resistance that happened here, the White Night riots that took place after the verdict was announced of Harvey Milk's killer. It was a very light verdict. And so that the gay community rose up against this injustice that happened and fought against the police. A lot of the stories I tell in the book have to do with fighting against the police, police brutality, repression, violence, unjust court rulings. These are often the sparks that set off a lot of protests and even violent protests. One running theme of the book is how actually police overreaction to protests is what makes most of them unsafe, and how the lack of use of de-escalation techniques or protecting protesters, how the over-militarization of the police is, especially after 9/11 and the Iraq invasion, has really caused protest violence to spike. And so it's one of the really interesting things from this is this is almost an alternate history of policing in the United States. From the very beginning, the Boston Massacre, which is commonly said to have helped set off the American Revolution, that was when the militia policing Boston, then the police, our version of the police, shot and killed 5 protesters. And the first protester to die was Crispus Attucks, who was a Black man. So we see even back then the version of the police overreacting to a protest and killing a Black person, which set off the American Revolution. Crispus is known as the first martyr of the American Revolution. And so seeing those kind of connections from way back then was, haunting and, put a lot in perspective. Let's see. What types of protests did you see from Native Americans? Did those also include art? That is an absolutely great question. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of art from the time of obviously colonial times and pre-colonial times. We don't have a lot of art, unfortunately, coming down from us to us. But we do talk to, I did talk a lot about how Native Americans rose up against colonists and how colonists, often violently repress these rebellions, setting, unfortunately, the tone for relations with Native Americans, throughout our history. North America before the colonists was already a complex place. Not all Native nations rejected the Europeans, which caused an ever-changing web of associations and hostilities to arise. Still, pushback against the colonists, both violent and nonviolent, grew as more colonists arrived and clashed with local people. One nonviolent protest tactic was silence. The refusal to trade or communicate with colonists, many of whom needed guidance and goods, was one way for locals to show colonists they weren't wanted. Other tactics were different. During the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, people in the Southwest, collectively known as the Pueblo, rose up against Spanish oppressors who had attempted to squelch their spiritual practices and culture. Enslaved and tortured by Spaniards who forced them to observe Catholic religious rituals and Spanish traditions, the Pueblo organized under the charismatic leader Pope and violently rebelled. The Pueblo killed priests, destroyed churches, and banished the Spanish from their territory in a victory for the people. So that's one little anecdote from the coverage of early Native American protests that I talk about. Did your research lead you to the Freedom Archives in the Mission? Are the International Women's Day demonstrations and Take Back the Night marches covered in the book? No to both of those. Unfortunately, hopefully we'll have an extension pack where I can talk about women, violence against women, and the protests in reaction to that more in depth. I do cover obviously the Women's March, which were the huge protests, and I talk about, you know, symbols like the pussy hat, and how the Women's March really helped normalize protest in this country, where protest became something other than, oh, that's something that people do in cities, to almost a family affair where you pack picnics and everybody carpooled because everyone's going to the protest, you know, and kind of made that. But unfortunately, I did not cover the Take Back the Night and the Women's Day International Women's Day demonstrations in the book. That was just a little outside of the scope of what I could do with my space, but I love that suggestion and would love to tackle that more, especially for young people who have to deal with a lot of, you know, violence and misogyny today. Is Cesar Chavez in the book? Yes, Cesar Chavez is in the book. I definitely cover the Great Boycott, which was such a huge part of our history and such a huge part of labor history itself. One of the other threads throughout the book is the evolution of labor unions and protections. You know, I talk about the Great Railroad Strike. I talk about the Porter Strike, which was when Black workers first rose up to demand protections, workplace protections, and a fairer wage. But definitely we do Cesar Chavez and the Great Boycott and Dolores Huerta and Larry Itliong. One of the wonderful things about writing about that is talking about how the different workers, you had the Filipino farm workers on one side and the Latino Mexican American farm workers on the other side, who were often in conflict with each other during this time. And of course that conflict was fomented by you know, the owners of the farms, because they wanted different groups to compete against each other so that they could keep wages low. What a great thing that was, that both groups came together to form this huge nationwide movement that even saw boycott marches and protests in Canada and England against the treatment of the farm workers in California, and of course led to the formation of the Farm Workers Union, which has a huge legacy here. Fantastic. Let's see if we've got any other questions here. One of the things that I loved writing about that was modern was hashtags and social media. And an interesting thing about the way that computers and the internet has helped protest messages explode and how people have kind of mastered this new medium was its roots in the WTO protests of 1999, the Battle of Seattle, as it was known, when the World Trade Organization was holding its annual meeting in Seattle. World Trade Organization, of course, is a world body, very exclusive, very undemocratic, that makes decisions about the world economy that often leads workers out, that often protects the rich at the expense of the poor. And there was going to be a World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle, and a lot of people decided that we're going to protest this. And so there was a huge protest in Seattle by young people, by poorer people, by people from all over the country came. And it was violently repressed by the police. This is where you began to see tear gas canisters being launched and the shields on both sides, where you begin to see Antifa rise against police persecution. And one of the major factors of that protest that became famous was it was really the first major protest that the internet helped spread. There was a group in England called the Electro Hippies, who were online pranksters, but they kind of became activists to help the World Trade Organization activists, the people against the World Trade Organization, come together and make plans to meet in Seattle and communicate during the whole protest, and even broadcast live. This was the first instance where protests were broadcast live on the internet in 1999, mostly because we didn't have the technology or the ability then for us to do that right on the ground. So it was really interesting to see the beginning of internet activism spring from the 1999 World Trade Organization protests. That was a cool thing. And you know, we still of course have legacy. Now we immediately turn to Twitter, or we immediately search the hashtags to see what's happening on the ground. We immediately share videos that people take on their phones. So it's really interesting to think about, just 20 years ago, people weren't able to do that. So that enormous explosion in activity around protests has helped a lot. Right. Let's see. We got some more messages here. Oh, thank you so much. Is there a reflection about communities within the US that have never led protests, i.e. Iranian, Hmong people? That's a really interesting question. You know, I don't really talk about people who haven't led major protests or been at the forefront, despite obviously being, you know, discriminated against. You know, I myself as a Lebanese American, you know, definitely felt after 9/11 a lot of prejudice, you know, and a lot of the discrimination. But it, you know, I never really thought to talk about how, you know, there wasn't a large uprising against that. Or, you know, there were definitely statements, and there's definitely wonderful groups that have done fantastic work on this. Like right now, we're seeing so much discrimination against Asian people, people of Chinese heritage because of the pandemic and the flu. And it's really fascinating to look at the ways that they're resisting in ways that aren't major protests or marches. And why aren't we all joining them? I think this is a great open question, and hopefully my book kind of will make people think about what they're protesting and what they're not protesting. Great. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to the public library. If there's any more questions, pop one in. You'll also have my social media addresses. Feel free to hit me up anytime. And thank you so much for listening to me.
Yay. I can unmute everybody too, and we can all give Marky a big unmuted. Yay. All right, everyone is unmuted.
Thank you.
Yay! Yay! Oh. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, friends, like I said, I will send you a document with lots of links. There was a lot talked about and so much stuff. And we're going to close it out with music tonight. How about that? All right. Let's do it.